Shalom, shalom, Osio, assalamu alaikum, hola, aloha. This is your brother Zach Bay, Indigenous American Moor, coming to you live and in full effect. Thank you for joining me. Please like, share, subscribe to my video. Hit that notification bell so you can get notified whenever I drop new content. I will be dropping and uploading content every single Sunday or Monday, Sunday or Moon Day of the week. Leave a comment, interact. Thank you for joining me. Please enjoy the music. I do not own the rights to this music, but I hope you enjoy. This evening, I wanted to speak on a few things, give you a few topics and subjects to look up, to study, things that might be affecting your life in like every day, that you may be aware of or you might not be aware of. I want to call this one 3/5 of a Man, Invisible Chains. I want to start off with a question. Things that are affecting your life daily. What has not been repealed or overturned to this day? What I mean, laws that have not been repealed or overturned. Some have been dialed back a little bit, but they're still in effect, and they're still causing effects and affects each and every day, and it's holding you down, holding you back. And you may not know why. You may be aware of, you may have heard some of these topics or subjects before, but I just want to go over a few of them with some detail, but just to pose questions and give you more things to think about and ask questions about. You gotta use your brain, use your God-given discernment. I want to give thanks to the Prophet Noble Drew Ali, the Prophet Muhammad, Yeshua the Christ, Buddha, and Confucius. And of course, all praises to the Most High God of the universe, Allah. Alright, so let's see. Number one, have you ever heard of the Christian Black Codes of 1724? Those are the Christian Black Codes. And it also has to do with the Black Codes of 1865, the Slave Codes of 1865. Just a few topics about this. They pretty much regulated how slaves or chattel property were to be treated in the Americas by pale Southerners, white Southerners. Pretty much just guidelines or legislation that was passed by governing bodies on how they could treat their property, certain guidelines that they had to live by, and it's like statutes and codes that they had to live under, mostly to govern the ownership of human capital, human property, chattel property, which were slave indigenous Americans, or in some cases imported Africans from the continent. But we all know the story that most of the population of captive slaves were from the Indian Wars that have been fought here in America, and they were captured indigenous Niji from this continent, from different tribes here on the East Coast, the Eastern Woodlands tribes. So some things that were outlawed and banned for captives or slaves to possess were horns, instrumental horns or drums. They were not allowed to have these things. And I think every single tribe you know of have types of horns or drums. Every indigenous tribe, horns or drums that were symbols of war and freedom and expression. The captive slaves were not allowed to have these things. they were deemed noisy or just outright banned from them having, because it could potentially alert other captives. And they were and still to this day, different drum beats by region and by tribes, how tribes would communicate with each other, distress or calls to raise arms and fight back. So they were not allowed to have horns or drums. Think about that. Think about how important those drums are to our people. Our people, more than any other people on this planet, can feel the beat and the rhythm of drums a lot easier, have some kind of spiritual connection to drums. This is something to think about. Those were the Christian Black Codes of 1724 and the slave codes or the Black Codes of 1865. Next topic is the one-drop rule. Now, mind you, these things have not been repealed or overturned. They have been dialed back with other legislation that's supposedly like curtailing them or just dialing them back, taking them less out of the forefront. But a lot of these things are still being applied to this day. Like I said, number 2, the one-drop rule or the racial purity rules. Okay, most people know about different classifications of Moors or indigenous Nietzsche now captured here, and so-called like pale-faced whites who wanted to allegedly keep their race pure by, if you mixed your blood with a captured indigenous or a so-called African, if you had one drop of their blood in your gene pool, you were no longer considered a white person. Right? Those are like racial purity acts, one-drop rules. They classify individuals as being mixed, and they called them mulattoes, quadroons, or octoroons, and those were the different degrees of mixtures of European and Anglo-Saxon so-called white DNA with the so-called black DNA or the indigenous DNA of the captive people here. Those people were not afforded full rights. They could not inherit property, and their status was pretty much held into whatever status their mother was. So if their mother was a captured, in most cases was a captured indigenous person, and most likely a slave, the child or the offspring would be considered to be a slave or a captive as well, because most of the so-called free white men would rape and have relations with their captured property, their captive slaves, servants, and they would not inherit the rights or the freedom of their father. They would only inherit the slave status of said mother, which would be a captive indigenous aboriginal. So that you have to think about that and how those one-drop rules are held today in some sort of societies and certain clubs. The KKK or the Ku Klux Klan really hold true to this, and we cannot forget those are Christians. The KKK and Ku Klux Klan are indeed Christians. The next, I want to speak on the Dred Scott case. All right, Dred Scott was a captured indigenous man here on the continent, so-called enslaved African, as terminology would go. He escaped from the South, made it to the North, to the so-called free states, and he was allegedly remanded. He was supposed to be remanded back to the South to be captured again as his property. but he filed a case with some help, a suit against his captive, his enslaver, and it was taken all the way to the highest court of the land, the Supreme Court. And within the scopes of that case, it was ruled that Dred Scott was a plaintiff in error and he would be remanded as a slave or a captive. Now, the importance of this case, it was deemed that blacks or Africans could not be citizens and are not citizens. And this case definitely has never been repealed or overturned to this day. So-called blacks or descendants of Africa who are originally actually Aboriginal indigenous to this land, Nijis, can still not be considered as citizens today. They are indeed 13th and 14th Amendment citizens, which are corporate entities, chattel property. They're not free citizens of this nation, but yet they are the true nationals of this land, which means that they have sovereignty, if only exercised. Now, I want to speak on how the plaintiff was in error. Now, the judges of the Supreme Court said the plaintiffs were in error. The plaintiff was in error, and the plaintiff was indeed Dred Scott. So, Dred Scott was in error by him calling himself Dred Scott. He did not consider himself or know that he was a Moor. He did not know he was a Moorish American. He did not know that he was a Moor, Aboriginal indigenous to this land. He still referred to himself as a enslaved, captured African, or a black, or a Negro, colored. All of those terms which do not denote to a free person. They only denote to slavery and chattel property. You have to remember that. They only denote to slavery and chattel property. So if you call yourself black, African American, Negro, colored, you are not a citizen of this country. You cannot be a citizen of this said government. But you can, and you are a national, a free sovereign on the land if you claim that status and you know that you are Moorish American, indigenous, Aboriginal, Niji. Alright. The Voting Rights Act. Now, the Voting Rights Act, which was part of the amendments that were passed for free chattel property, 13th and 14th Amendment, so they could have the ability to vote as citizens or said property as free persons, which are, when you look at the legal definition of persons, it is indeed a legal entity. So, in order for so-called blacks, African Americans, Negro, colored people to indeed vote, it has to be re-signed and renewed every 25 years. Now you can go look this up. The renewal of the Voting Rights Act. The last person to renew this act and to sign this act was indeed President of the United States Corporation, George W. Bush Jr. He signed this back in 2006 when he was in office. He re-signed this act to ensure that for the next 25 years, 14th Amendment citizens will be allowed to vote in said elections, and it will again need to be signed right at the end of that next 25-year period. You can look this up whenever you need to. It can all be verified, but this act has to be signed, and it's always re-signed every 25 years. So think about what could potentially happen if this act does not get re-signed, does not get renewed. Will so-called black, African American, Negro, colored people, will they be allowed to vote in the said free election? Will those votes count? Ask yourself that. If it's not signed, legally they don't have the right to vote. These are the only group of so-called free people in this country that has to have their votes renewed every 25 years. That's the renewal of the Voting Rights Act. Next, I want to speak on redlining. Now, redlining was legally used by banks, corporations, different entities, companies, government bodies, for housing, credit lines, jobs, and loans from banking institutions, different companies or communities. So redlinings will be these invisible lines that correlates to zip codes and different zoning lines and legislation that was passed in certain areas or communities, that anybody within these zones could not move freely as far as owning property, land, getting loans, houses. So think, whenever you go to a banking institution or housing loans, you have to give certain information, social security number, zip code, and within these numbers they can decide and determine whether or not you are in a redlining zone or type of capacity of movement. And it really has a lot of sway over whether or not you'll be able to move into a certain neighborhood or community, or whether or not your credit will be approved, whether or not your loan will be approved. Can you get, so why is it so difficult for so-called Black people, African Americans, Negroes, colored people to get certain loans from banks to start businesses in their community, to get any type of loan for finance, or to get certain housing loans to move into certain communities? Why do they have to run your credit? Certain jobs you're allowed to get, they have to run your credit. It has to do with redlining. These type of tactics are still being used to this very day and holding people back. Invisible chains. It's called redlining. You can look this up. There's been a lot more talk about it in this recent time, in this recent era, about these redlining practices. There were whole communities that were set up that inside their deeds and leases for said property, for houses, entire communities that would be called covens, that inside the deed it would say specifically that this property cannot and should not be sold to anybody of African American, Negro, colored, or slave descent. So that was ways that they could make sure certain communities and areas would stay so-called white only. They would not sell to anybody who was not of that said persuasion. Now, once again, you can look these things up. Lastly, I want to speak on the 3/5 compromise that was part of the U.S. Constitution for the United States of America Republic. All right, it's the 3/5 compromise. Now, this goes into the fact that it was deemed necessary for so-called captive slaves to be considered as 3/5 of a man. That means 3/5 of a full person, to have personhood. So it would take 5. So out of 5 captive slaves or captured indigenous Neji, out of 5 of them, only 3 could be considered to be counted on a census, population, taxation, things of that nature. So it was a way of keeping the population under control, and so certain states would have fairer representation, because it was deemed that each state would get a certain amount of representatives in Congress and in the Senate for the population of said state. So southern states would somehow have an advantage because their states contained most of, if not all of, captured indigenous population held as slaves. and they wanted to use that as leverage to have more representation inside of Congress or the Senate. So they wanted to use their slave populations as numeration to be counted and considered as part of the general population. So for the northern states did not have said slave populations, and they would only count free white people as slaves. Once again, they would not count free Indians on the land, anybody who did not come underneath that exact status of slave or Negro, but there were free people of color who could not fall into the lines of these guides when they were making these legislations and laws. So it was deemed necessary that slave populations could not be counted fully, as each individual, each captive being held as a full person in all lives and aspects of life. So they deemed it necessary for slaves to only be counted as 3/5 of a person, of a man. So it had a lot to do with the population count, representation. So ask yourself, is this being used today? In most census counts on the record, it's always stated that so-called Black or African American, Negroes, colored people are counted as 13% of the general population in whole in America. Now, this number has not changed in decades. Ask yourself, through incarceration and death, childbirth, many different factors on how this number could easily be changed or swayed. How come this number has never changed? Are they, in fact, to this day, still using the 3/5 compromise? Mind you, it's in the Constitution. The 3/5 compromise. Are they, in fact, still using these very same tactics and legislations to keep track or to keep the population of so-called Negroes, African Americans, Blacks, as that same exact 13% to this day? Because it has not changed in decades, even though there has been a spike in childbirths. All right, those are some of the things I wanted to bring to your attention. Ask yourself these questions. Go research these questions. Hopefully it's information that you have heard before, but if you have not heard before, I'm glad that you tuned into my channel to get this information. Once again, that was the Christian Black Codes of 1724, the Slave Codes of 1865, the One Drop Rule or Racial Purity Acts, the Dred Scott case, the Voting Rights Act, the renewal of the Voting Rights Act, and redlining, and the 3/5 compromise. Thank you for joining me once again. This is your brother Zach Bay, Indigenous American More. Thank you. Like, share, subscribe, hit that notification bell. Peace. Islam.